Hi. Hi, my friends. Welcome to our 9th DLD Sync. I'm Steffi Czerny, founder of DLD. I'm very proud to invite you to this first intergenerational family talk at DLD Sync. Welcome, Richard Edelman and Margot Edelman. It will be a father and a daughter talk. Isn't it amazing? I think we need much more intergenerational things. So I'm assuming that many of you know what Edelman is. It's the global powerhouse in terms of communication and PR. It's the world's largest communication house in terms of revenue. It has 55 global offices and more than 5,000 employees. It's amazing. It's really a global powerhouse. So Margot is the senior vice president and leads the Edelman technology team based in San Francisco. And my good friend, Richard, we know each other for a long time. I feel like a family to you. Please give my regards to your sister and to your wife. Richard is the CEO of Edelman. And needless to say that both Richard and Margot are good friends of DLD. And we have one thing in common, a very important thing, because it defines our work. We want to find out what the drivers for societal change are. Who are the drivers? Who are the change makers? Who are the agents of change? What are the needed topics we all have to know about? Richard and Margot are not only outstanding communication pros, they are also experts on trust. They are the leaders behind the important annual Edelman Trust Barometer. It's a must for all the CEOs in Davos to be at the presentation of the Trust Barometer. And you should see this. They come all together and they want to know what's going on in the world, are the strategies behind it, and how can they work with this data. It's a benchmark to determine and political and societal and economical state of our world. It's an obligatory session for all the big shots. In May, the Trust Barometer had its spring update. And of course, in May, 4 months later, everything has changed. So we are really greedy and curious and want to know what's going on. I think together with the COVID analytics, it's also important the latest events, the latest happenings. I think we all stand together in the fight against racism. It's such an important topic, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts about it. Trust me, dear audience, this will be a wonderful talk. So, Richard, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steffi, my younger sister. And I appreciate your kind words about our family. So let me try to set a stage for you about trust. We've been looking at trust for 20 years, since the battle in Seattle in 1999. And what we found at that time was that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, were the most trusted institution ahead of business, government, or media. Over the succeeding 20 years, every January we present in Davos, and we look at trust through the prism of ability, dependability, integrity, and purpose. If you think of the x-axis as competence and the y-axis as ethics, more or less, that's the construct. And we go out to 28 countries around the world, and we find who's ahead in trust, how CEOs are trusted, etc. There are 4 or 5 important things to remember over the history of the Trust Barometer. The first is that there have been various waves against trust. So the first wave was globalization, the second wave was the Great Recession, the third wave was the mass class divide, the fourth wave was the battle for truth, and the fifth wave is now the pandemic. Because each one of these events, each one of these big waves has a undermining effect on institutions. which is why we, in January, had data that was amazing to us. It was that business, for the first time, was the most trusted institution, that in fact, trust had moved in sequence from vertical, the sort of Moses model of speaking from the mountain, the CEO approach. I talk down to you, to my audience. Over 10 years, it moved to a horizontal picture of peer-to-peer based on social platforms. And in the last year and a half, it has moved to local, partly because of the problems of fake news on social, and partly because of the rise of the corporation, where my employer became the most trusted institution in the world. So I get my information from Steffi or others in Berta, and I believe it because it comes from my employer, because it's local, and I can see her and look in her eyes. So therefore, the data from January was a big delta between business on the top, NGOs quite close, but media and government and the bottom. So we come into COVID, and you come in weakened relatively for crisis, because the two institutions that you usually count on during an epidemic or big crisis are government and media. Media to tell you the truth, and government to act. Well, here's what's happened in the last 4 months. A shocking revival for government. A huge, as if it's the dream of Mr. Hobbes, government is the most trusted institution in the world, ahead of NGOs, business, or media. In fact, the 11-point rise is the biggest rise we've ever seen. It's the first time government has been the most trusted, and we believe it's because this is the biggest kind of problem we've seen in the world since World War II. This jump dwarfs what happened in 2001 after 9/11, and also after 2008 with the Great Recession. So the tables have been fundamentally turned in just a few months. Next slide. The jump in government trust is massive. Nothing other than to say that. 20 points in Canada, 20 points in Germany, 24 points in the UK, etc. The only places it didn't go up much was the United States. That jump in trust in government is actually not in the federal government, it's more in the state and local. Next slide. Government's job is not just to run things, but to do things. In this pandemic, contain the disease, be the information source, give us economic relief, help us cope mentally, get our country back to normal. It's a stunning cross-the-board reliance on government. We believe this is a bubble. This will not last. It will get even. Why? Because every time there are big jumps, it's almost always followed by significant declines. We looked at prior big jumps of institutions, 17 double-digit trust gains in the last decade, 13 to 17 cases followed by a trust loss 1 year later. We predict by the time of Davos in January, government will have receded, business will have come up. It all depends on how business performs in a time post-COVID in the opening. Next. We came into this problem at time of COVID with some fears. And the first fear was job loss, and it has a lot to do with technology. And for all of you on who are VCs and other, pay real attention to this. 80% in January were worried about losing jobs to automation, globalization like this. On top of that, we find a whole new set of people scared about job loss to the pandemic, obvious when you have 14% unemployment in the US, et cetera. Next slide. But the concerns are magnified by the epidemic of fake news. 2/3 of people worry about fake news. Just about half of the people find it hard to get reliable information. This is an unstable platform on which to get to truth. And you get to truth through quality information. Next. It's amazing the consensus around giving government the ability, first of all, to lock us down, and second of all, to have my personal health and location tracking information. Again, we do not think this lasts. It is more profound approval in developing markets than developed. But again, to have 50% of Americans or more in developed countries saying, yeah, it's okay, we need to do this for government for now, that's amazing. Go ahead. This is the money slide in the deck. If you want to try to understand what happened in America in the last 2 weeks in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, 3 pieces. 1, mass class divide. 5 times as many African Americans died of COVID in my hometown of Chicago as white, 5 times. Because they came in more sick, they had less access to health, they have to work in frontline jobs, they can't Zoom into meetings. So all those factors. 2, president, hold on. And then 3, job loss. So all of those are tinder. I'll get to the race issue in a moment. But the key point about COVID is it has spotlighted societal inequity. When you see that 2/3 of people say something has to be done to more fairly distribute our country's wealth and prosperity, that is a sign of it's going to be higher taxes, it's going to be more government, because business is not seen as having fair distribution of the wealth it produces. Next. I find this slide amazing. For you non-Americans, it is a little bit like watching the Truman Show with Jim Carrey. Anyway, the gap between the federal government trust and local government trust has never been more profound. Take a look for Democrats, it's 33 points. We trust, as Democrats, governors and mayors. We do not trust the president. Meanwhile, more or less, the president is very trusted by Republicans. And the other thing to note is, and Steffi, please take a look here, there is a nearly 30-point gap in trust between Republicans and Democrats about media. In fact, for Republicans, there are 2 media. One is real Donald Trump on Twitter. The other is Fox. Next slide. So Margot, to you.
Great, thank you. So we really see from the data, this is going to be a moment of reckoning for the business community. We see here in this slide that CEOs are really failing to demonstrate the leadership that the public has expected of them during the pandemic. The majority of people say CEOs should lead on addressing the pandemic rather than waiting for government to impose changes. However, respondents actually rank CEOs last at 29 points at meeting the demands placed on them by the pandemic. And they're ranking last behind such beloved groups as journalists or local government leaders. And scientists, perhaps not surprisingly, are actually seen as doing the best. So we can really see that this is sort of a wake-up call for CEOs in terms of how they've performed in terms of the pandemic. We also see that the majority of people don't necessarily see business as meeting the challenges of the pandemic with the appropriate level of competence. This in particular relates to companies' performance on ensuring products and services are readily available, protecting essential employees whose jobs require them to work outside the home. That goes back to Richard's conversation about people who can't necessarily sit behind their screen as people who are on the front lines every day. And then they don't necessarily see business as preparing for the eventual recovery and helping to return things to normal as quickly as possible. So business is actually not performing up to its standards in a lot of these aspects. Business is also not necessarily seen as looking out for its employees or its business partners. People don't necessarily see business as putting their own people before profits. They don't necessarily see them as protecting their employees' financial well-being or safeguarding their jobs. And they don't necessarily see them as a good partner. Business is not necessarily helping their smaller suppliers or their customers stay in business. So not necessarily great showing for the business community throughout this pandemic. So now let's actually look at trust in the different sectors of business. So what we can see here from the data is actually that the greatest gains in trust were in industries that have been on the front lines of the pandemic. That is the food and beverage sector, which went up by 9 points and actually is ranking #1, and then the healthcare industry, which increased by 8 points on trust. And the tech industry, which was the most trusted industry, is now third. And it's actually slightly declined in trust since we did this survey in January. And frankly, this was actually surprising data, to me at least, given that technology has underpinned so much of our life during the pandemic, whether it's Teams, whether it's Zoom, whether it's online, online grocery shopping. So much of our life has become online during the pandemic. And this is not just in the United States, this is a global phenomenon. What we see actually in the 11 markets we surveyed is that trust in technology declined or stagnated in the majority of markets. And what's interesting here actually is in the traditionally kind of technology, potentially distrusting markets, UK, Germany, trust in tech actually went up slightly. And then in China, trust in tech ranks the highest, again, not surprisingly, because, for example, China has deployed apps based on, Alipay or WeChat as a way to have people return to life as normal. So technology has really, been used in China to underpin the recovery. And again, this has been a multi-year phenomenon. So from 2012 to 2020, we can see the gap in trust in business to trust in tech has gone from 30 points, where it stood in 2012, to 12 points, where it stood in May of 2020. So we really see that while business has increased in trust, technology has remained stagnant or actually decreased. Where technology companies did get points during the pandemic was on their preparedness for the pandemic itself. We see that while 61% of all employees thought that their employers were well prepared, 75% of those who worked for tech companies thought they were. And again, this relates directly back to tech companies' actions at the beginning of the pandemic. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook all sent their employees home right away when everything started. So it was a way for them to show their employees that they were ready and that they understood what was going on and the seriousness of what could happen. So how does business increase trust? What do businesses need to do to build their reputation and build back the trust that they potentially have ceded to other institutions? So what we see is that our data shows that business needs to join the fight against the pandemic. They need to take steps such as collaborating with competitors to develop a more effective response to the pandemic. For example, as Google and Apple have done by partnering to create an API to facilitate contact tracing. They also recommend switching production from what they currently make to things that are needed during the pandemic. For example, as HP did by 3D printing masks and other key equipment during the pandemic itself. So there are key steps that people believe that business can take in order to rebuild trust. People also want brands to focus their message on solutions rather than focusing on selling. So they want people, for example, to focus on how products can help people cope with the challenges related to life during the pandemic. They don't want to just be sold something or actually ignore everything that's going on in the world. And then finally, in terms of return to work, people actually want governments to prioritize health and safety. And they actually want people to be saving as many lives as possible, even if this means the economy sustains damage, rather than restarting the economy and potentially having the fallout, minimizing the fallout there. And then finally, people actually think business should partner with government on a responsible return to work. So rather than having CEOs take the lead in terms of deciding when to go back to work, people actually think that health authorities, followed by the national government, are the ones who should be in charge. And they actually want CEOs to be conservative in getting back to normal operations, rather than kind of charging ahead and going back if there are risks. And this is particularly important right now as Western Europe starts to open up, as the United States goes back to normal. It's important for business to keep this in mind as they think about paths to return to work. So finally, there are 5 key conclusions that we want to reiterate in terms of how organizations today can build and maintain trust. First is that tangible action is needed to preserve this increase in trust for the long term. Second, it's that business and government need to collaborate on solutions. Third, business needs to live up to its multi-stakeholder promise. It can't just think about its shareholders. It needs to think about all the different stakeholder groups in which it operates and which it serves. Fourth, CEOs need to demonstrate public leadership. It's not enough just to address their employees. They need to act as leaders throughout the world as a whole and think about the multiple stakeholder constituencies that they're serving. And then finally, the return to work, which we're facing right now, as you know, in the United States, in Europe, many companies in Asia have already gone back to work. This return to work will be a test for trust, and it'll be a test for the opportunity for business and government to collaborate. Now I'd like to turn it back to Richard to take us through some of our most recent data on trust in terms of how brands need to stand up to systemic racism.
So, like many of you, I was stunned, appalled, and sickened by the 9-minute video of a policeman in Minneapolis murdering George Floyd. And this is only one of many instances in which police have acted badly. It's the nicest word I can use. In Chicago, a policeman shot a young black man 18 times, Laquan McDonald, in the back as he was walking away. So why do this study over this last weekend? Well, I was in New York City last Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday nights, and there were first peaceful protests, and then looters went into stores and emptied out hundreds of stores, big ones, small ones, personal care products to Chanel dresses. And for me, this is more than a moment in time. This is a turning point. Actually, the combination of unemployment from COVID, the reality of the president, and the unbelievable act in Minneapolis have set a match to wood that's ready to burn. And when you see weeks of public protests by people of all colors, it's significant. And it's also significant that the CEOs who spoke out last week were actually seen as insufficient, making promises and not actually changing much. So it's our thesis that the torch must pass. It must pass from the CEO to the brands, because CEOs speak horizontally, CEOs speak vertically, brands speak horizontally. Brands have relationship, CEOs have transactions. And therefore, we also need to use the power of brand spend behind the idea of ending systemic racism in the US and in other markets in the world. So, next slide. Here's the story. 2/3 of people, of the 2,000 people we surveyed over the weekend, are concerned about systemic racism. Nearly half are extremely concerned. On a 10-point scale, that means 8 or 9. I want you to take a look at the data on the right, which is also by ethnic group. 91% of Black, 70% of Latino, almost 70% of Asian American, who, by the way, had a horrendous time since COVID occurred. In fact, Chinese being punched out in Chinatown in Manhattan, boycotts of restaurants, sickening. And then 57% of whites. Important that it's a majority of whites. In terms of political affiliation, you know that America is deeply divided, but on this point, by more than 2-to-1, it's a Democrat versus Republican, 84 versus 40 on concern about racism in America. On gender and age, it is a millennial issue most at 70%, but quite high in my age category, 59%, 55 plus. It's also a female issue more than a male issue, 69% of women versus 58% of men. Next slide. Here's the money slide. Historically, brands have stayed away from race as the third rail issue in America. You just can't win. Well, what I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, is brands that take a stand on racial inequality will benefit substantially. If you don't, you will be punished by people who will assume that that means that you endorse the status quo. You have no choice today but to act. And you need to act by improving what's in your business, meaning changing, no, go back, please. Too quick. I just want to go through the stats here. By 4 to 1, people say, I am more likely to give you trust than take trust away from you if you take a stand. And some of these numbers are just stunning. 6 to 1 Asian Americans, etc. Next. More than a third of people have already switched brands and convinced others to stop using brands based on taking a stand. That's a big number. It's equivalent to what we found in our COVID research 2 months ago, if companies were standing up appropriately. Again, higher among Black, Democrat, women, and millennials. Next slide. So, in conclusion on this matter of race, I urge all of you to do 3 things. 1, make sure your own house is in order. We at Edelman still have work to do. I'm going to appoint a person to the main board of the family company. Also, I'm going to make sure that we have more representation on our management team at the highest level. You also have to educate and advocate and inspire. Use your marketing money to give us hope, give us direction. And lastly, you have to get involved in the hard work of fixing things. Example, Ben & Jerry's ice cream is employing people who are actually getting out of jail for misdemeanors on the basis that they deserve a second chance. So now's the time to show that capitalism is in fact a force for good and demonstrate that it can actually fight and end racism in our country. Okay, time for questions for Margot and me.
Great. Thank you. Well, I have some toughies here that I've put together, so get ready. But we'll start with a softball one. So Edelman has been studying trust for the past 20 years. Why is trust so important? And can you give us some insight into what you've learned over the past 2 decades that perhaps can help explain where we are today?
So trust in a sort of 20 years ago context was really something that enabled commerce. It was, the U.S. was seen as a high trust market. Korea was a low trust market. America with a great legal system. Korea with too much family companies and things like this. And that was the Francis Fukuyama kind of period of the end of history and America triumphant and, the Soviet Union, bye-bye. It's become more complicated because there's been a lot of misbehavior by business, also by government, scandals, and people's basic preconception about systems working is now challenged. And so we're in a place and time when the ice flows are moving quickly, government's up and then it'll be down. It's volatile. And it's volatile because people don't have exactly a sense of belief. And again, trust is really in 4 things: ability, dependability, integrity, and purpose. And the ability thing, business always does pretty well, usually, because we're competent, capable. But the ethical behavior thing, whether it's on pay, whether it's on racial injustice, whether it's treatment of employees, all is to be done. So trust has become a vital aspect of you being able to get new technologies approved, and you being able to get funding. And it's the central question of our society at the moment. Next question.
Great. So as we saw in the presentation, government has clearly seen a massive uptick in trust across the board, even in the United States, where it hasn't seen quite as much as other countries. Is this going to last? And does government's response to what's going on in the world right now have an impact on whether it will last?
So this crisis is the most global and profound challenge since World War II. And that was the last time that such license was given to government. It can't last. It can't last because we can't afford it. And it can't last because the current crop of government leaders is not Churchill and FDR. And so it's going to take business leaders to come into the void, whether you're a DLD funded venture kind of person or whether you're running a big tech company. You have to constantly have in your head those four criteria: ability, dependability, integrity, and purpose. And also recognizing that you can't make decisions on your own without explaining how and why and where and what your plan is, and that you'll be judged on it. It's transparency of a new level. And lastly, that in fact, the idea of stakeholder capitalism is the one that's going to make capitalism function and be seen as a force for good.
Great. And then in the United States specifically, do you think this could be a moment where the US starts to rebuild, where businesses do things differently, where perhaps government does things differently, given the demands that people are placing on the country right now?
An optimist would tell you that that's, of course, what's going to happen. And what I actually see, and the reason that I am optimistic, is leaders in this country sense a void. And they sense a void on the basis of age group. Both of the candidates for president are 77 years old. They sense a void also in capacity, that government can do so much, that business in a certain way is more free to be innovative and take some chances and apologize for trying, but don't ask permission, kind of thing. So I think the idea of more business involvement in education, as IBM has done, or in somehow dealing with racism, is all to the good. It's going to take a steady hand and not have rabbit ears. If you're playing a tennis match and you're just listening to the crowd and it's good or bad, or you make a bad shot, just play the game and cover up your ears. You just have to have some. You have to be a little stoic here and not lose your nerve. Just operate on the basis of what you think is correct and do it, and don't be so shaken so easily.
Great. Continuing on this line of questioning, the data showed that people believe that CEOs were failing to basically meet the demands of the pandemic. As we saw in the data, they were behind journalists, which is not necessarily a great place to be in terms of trust. So why do you think this is the case? And then are there any CEOs or companies that you think bucked this trend and really did stand up and do a good job?
So I also want to go to a question that's similar from Alexandra, who says, what do you recommend corporate leaders do to speak out at this time when trust has been weaponized and actors are intentionally filling the arena with misinformation? Because I think those two things are together. This is a moment for public leadership. It's going to require CEOs to talk frequently, directly, and with facts. We have such misinformation in the world. We have a certain leader of a certain important country who regularly is a little off on the truth. And so we go to that which we now believe in, which is actually our employers. And therefore, the responsibility on you who are running or financing companies is immense. You have a big new job, truth teller, fact finder. And your websites need to actually cover and remember, the news media is shrunken, especially local news is cut by half in the number of reporters in the newsroom. So I know many of you are in tech, so that's got a very big set of reporters. But again, the necessity of, here's a stat, a stunning stat. Of 400 op-eds that were in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal for the month of April, 2 were from CEOs. One was from Mark Zuckerberg, one was from a financial services one. That's crazy. We need public leadership. Public leadership means take the risk of ordeal by media. And also talk to your people. They're scared. They're nervous about their health. They're nervous about their jobs. The only way you calm people down is talk to them. And if you don't know, say so. And if you can't do something today, for example, about racism, if your house isn't perfectly in order, so what? Just say what it is and say what you're going to do about it. That's what I'm doing.
Great. Continuing on the dialogue about racism in America and brands standing up against systemic racism, which brands do you see as leading on this dialogue? And then secondly, are there ways that companies can influence change through their actions?
I think Starbucks is leading. And I think a lot of companies like McDonald's are just doing the minimum standard and just saying, so in Maslow's hierarchy, it's sort of acknowledge, advocate, educate, initiate. So I think a lot of companies are doing the acknowledge because that's the minimum standard. That's that'll get the people off my back. Okay, that's pretty lame, but that's what they do. The advocate is, okay, Nike put up an ad and says, no time anymore to just listen. That was important, not sufficient. Then the educate is, we need more campaigns like the Dove campaign for real beauty, except focused on race. And then the innovate and initiate is, Ben and Jerry's or other, Ben and Jerry's employs people who've had misdemeanors. That's smart. That's good business, and it's damn important for society, especially in a society where you have 2 million people in jail at the moment. We can't just have those be people permanently on a desert island. Next question.
Great. The data also shows us that people want brands to focus on solutions, whether it's solutions to the pandemic, perhaps solutions to racism, not selling. What are examples of brands that have presented solutions rather than selling products?
I think State Farm Insurance, by cutting auto rates by 20% during COVID, that was really smart. I think a company such as Microsoft making available a health bot that substituted for a doctor's advice if in fact you fed in half a dozen statistics like your temperature or like this. It said you better go to the doctor. Don't wait. Don't pass. Go. And so if you have a sense of, I think we're also sort of past the time for cause-related marketing, the Project Reds of the world. I think that's fine, but it's just not the time. We actually need things, Shonda Rhimes shooting ads that are provocative, that show brands and people of color in a way aspiring, achieving, and the best part of America or the world. It's advocacy advertising, but without sort of having to give part of the revenue to a cause. We should just do it.
Great. And then switching gears slightly to really focus on return to work. We saw from the data that 75% of respondents thought that CEOs should be conservative in getting back to normal operations, including the return to work. And also we've seen that, for example, Twitter has said that, its employees can work from home indefinitely. Is work going to look different post-pandemic? And if so, how?
Well, I can't wait to get back to work for one, but, that's me. The reality of getting back to work should be putting the responsibility on the employee and making sure that the employee feels comfortable in commuting, safe at work, and that his or her kids are okay and able to be dealt with over the summer in a positive manner. And so don't rush. And I think, again, I'm going to have to set an example and not, make people feel bad if they don't come to work and all the rest. People should also stagger their commutes, especially in places like New York that rely on subways. So it's safety first, second, and third. And we've proven that we can operate remotely. That's sure. The people who should be worried are landlords, because we're going to diminish our footprint. That's for sure.
Great.
Can I turn the table?
You by all means.
I've been waiting for this moment all my life.
All right.
So Margot, the tech industry seems to me to be, in one sense, the catbird seat, right? Because employees feel it was well prepared and all this, but also all these issues of privacy and security, and they're all going to sort of come to the fore quite quickly, and there's going to be clashes maybe between business and government. What's going to happen? What should we do?
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think in terms of understanding even just around contact tracing apps, for example, what is that going to look like? In the United States, are we going to go towards a model that looks more like China, which has basically, had a significant partnership between business and the government in order to create contact tracing apps that work for everyone, assigns everyone a color based on their feeling of safety. If you're red, you have to quarantine. If you're yellow, you might have been, next to somebody who had COVID. And if you're green, you're free to live your life freely. Or are we going to be more like Europe that actually now relies on, contact tracing that is pretty old school? You go to a coffee shop, you write your phone number down, and if it turns out somebody had it, you might get a phone call telling you that you might have been exposed. And I think, at least in the United States, we haven't necessarily found a path forward between the two. But I absolutely think that there's going to be clashes, and I think ultimately it's something that the citizens are going to have to decide where, what's more important to us. Is it, health? Is it being able to go back freely and, be able to, live a normal life and use an app for that? And maybe you have your data goes to the government, but, you can also just go live your life freely. Or are we going to prioritize privacy and, not necessarily be quite as safe, at least from the pandemic standpoint, but be able to, live our life without having our data exposed to the government or potentially exposed to hacks? And I'm not necessarily sure which one it is, and I'm not sure people are sure yet. I think it's something, sort of a fine line we have to strike.
So trust is at the core of the proposition of sharing economy companies. And so how do you see the way forward for an Airbnb or Uber or others that have had substantial cutbacks in staff, and are they coming back?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think for Airbnb, it's very specifically tied to the hospitality industry, which has obviously seen a huge hit. So I think that's sort of in a category of its own, and very likely something that will not really come back until the hospitality industry has a rebound, unless they're successful in diversifying into different revenue streams, whether that's online experiences or really being able to build up their business in countries that have experienced much more successful kind of returns to normalcy than the United States has. I think for something like Uber, I mean, the fact that there is an online rating system is actually incredibly helpful, because you're able to rate your passenger, you're able to rate the driver, and you can potentially see how well they're actually following the rules, around the pandemic? Are they wearing a mask? That could be something that, you rate into the app, just like you're rating how good of a driver they are or how good of a passenger they are. So in some ways, a two-sided marketplace actually really allows, I think, companies like an Uber to potentially be, very successful in responding to what's going on today.
So tech companies have been the most marvelous multinational employers. However, they are not seen as particularly great places for African American and Hispanic talent. They haven't achieved that. What do you think, if we look 5 years from now, will be the numbers in those categories, and what should tech companies do about it?
You know what? I can't make a prediction on the numbers. They're if you actually look at the stats, they're quite low today in terms of the numbers of people that actually work in software engineering jobs, and even lower in leadership. What I'm hopeful about is that there is enough change that's being demanded by employees. People in San Francisco are extremely progressive. They're extremely at the forefront of demanding change. So what I'm hoping is that, employees of tech companies actually are the ones who force a change for their employer, who advocate for, better hiring practices. You can't necessarily, for example, don't hire, a white or Asian candidate unless you've interviewed a Black candidate or a Hispanic candidate for the role. For example, there's also an opportunity potentially to have more of your suppliers be from Black-owned or minority-owned businesses. And then I also think for those within leadership positions at these companies, really working to create a mentorship program for entry-level employees to help them navigate the hierarchy and help them move up the food chain. So I'm really hopeful that employees will be the ones who start this movement and advocate for change at these companies.
And do you think that there will be a dispersion of tech company headquarters to smaller cities in the wake of COVID?
I think we're already seeing that happen. Tech companies have, a lot of them now have distributed workforces and are doing it just fine, just as, Twitter has, told its teams that they can work from home indefinitely. Facebook is actually looking at having high performance employees be able to work from home as well. So it's definitely already happening. In terms of the headquarters themselves, I think the headquarters might just stay in San Francisco since it's a tech hub, and that's where historically technology has had its strongest foothold in America. But I definitely think in terms of the day-to-day employees that work at the companies, absolutely it'll get distributed throughout the United States, and again, it's already happening.
And you've worked with DJI and Tencent, two Chinese companies, trying to get them with good reputations in America. Do you see the US-China competition increasing? And what do you think is the best way forward for a Chinese company?
I definitely see it increasing. Just over the past 4 years, you can definitely see tensions rising. Companies have been put on the US entity list, for example, obviously Huawei being the most prominent example. So I think for companies like a DJI, like a Tencent, like a ByteDance, which owns TikTok, I think it's increasingly important to be transparent and to really demonstrate through whether it's studies that show that they're not giving their data to China, whether it's having a board of directors that is predominantly American or Western European, really showing that these companies are not Chinese companies, that they're global companies, and that they're transparent about where their data goes, and that they're thinking with a global mindset, not a China first mindset.
So I got a question from the field on purpose. Do you think that tech companies distinguish between purpose and kind of cause marketing? And is there a tech company you think is particularly distinguished in the purpose area? This is from Alexandra.
It's your question, right? Or my question?
You answer it.
All right. Purpose that harms people and purpose that helps people. I think the most important thing for a company, at least as I think about having a purpose, is one that ties directly back to their core to what they actually do. So I think if you're a company and you pick something that seems completely out of left field, you're not going to seem necessarily like it makes sense. It'll seem a little bit out of left field, and it'll seem a little bit like, it's cause marketing. Whereas a company can have a purpose that ties directly to what it does. And I think it actually makes a big impact. So just a couple examples from technology from the pandemic itself, for that, for example, ServiceNow created apps for emergency responders during the pandemic. And Coursera, for example, actually made all of its courses be free online so that everyone could access them. And these are things that both help the community, but also tie directly back to what the company does. And I think having that balance between doing something that's good, but also something that relates to the company's core competency is really important for getting it right.
So, Margot, the number of reporters in the world is shrinking, except in tech. And so do you see a continuing boom for tech journalism? Has tech journalism changed substantially? And what's the future?
Sure, that's a really good question. And as a PR professional, I'm happy to be in an industry where there are still lots of people to pitch to who are smart and have their finger on the pulse. What I think has changed is that there's become a lot more skepticism of the technology industry over the past few years, whether it is reporters heavily looking at Facebook and kind of, whether understanding about, fake news, the impact on the election, really heavily digging into that. It's reporters looking at SoftBank and the failed investments in WeWork and the implications for having, huge amounts of capital given to early stage founders, or now looking at Amazon, for example, and the treatment of workers. I think reporters have taken a much more skeptical lens to the technology industry and are not afraid to kind of hold it to task for some things they might not necessarily see as best practice. Whereas I think before it was a little bit more starry-eyed and, promoting the latest product, which is great, but I think it's actually a positive evolution that the media has sort of held itself up as a watchdog for the tech industry. And I do think going forward, there's going to be increasingly a focus on what is the impact of technology outside of Silicon Valley. It's very easy to say, okay, oh, isn't this cool that, there's now a robot doing deliveries and, follow the robot around, do a little video. What is actually going to be the implication of that? Does it mean that people are going to be put out of work? Does it mean that, it's going to change the way that societies interact with each other? And so I think it's going to be increasingly almost like an inside out view at the tech industry and looking at the implications that these new technologies are going to have on society, both in the larger United States and outside.
My 2-second add on that is I think automation is the central issue for the next decade for the tech industry, and that all of you have to be involved in promoting retraining and repurposing of employees. And it can't just be, oh, well, we sell them machines that somehow eliminate work and we'll give them a guaranteed minimum income on that basis. No, if there's anything that COVID has proven, it is the psychic value of people getting up, going to work in one way or another, and feeling as if they're part in a society. So that means that you really have, as tech companies, to help on improving junior colleges and other means of getting people retrained. So we're sort of coming to the end here, I think in like 4 or 5 minutes. Margot, you want to make a final sort of passionate statement about what tech should do, and then I'll close up?
I don't know if I have a passionate statement about what tech should do, but I do think this is, a moment of opportunity for the technology industry really to step up. I think there's been a lot of leadership by the tech industry during the pandemic, and I know said in the data that trust in the tech industry did not go up, but there's been a lot of sort of individual examples of leadership by technology companies, whether it was HP 3D printing masks, whether it's Apple and Google partnering on, an API for contact tracing. There's been so many moments where the technology industry has really made a difference with its actions. And I think going into these issues around, systemic racism in America, the continuing issue of the pandemic, I think this is really an opportunity for the tech industry to continue to step up and use its power for good.
My 2 comments at the end are, First, to all of you VCs, I please urge you to pay attention to the mass class divide and to the marches on racism in America, and be part of fixing it. Push your companies to employ more people of color. Get involved in the D&I programs and don't just leave it to HR. Your job is to be good capitalists, and our system is really in a moment of vulnerability, and you can make a huge difference. I also want to, for those of you who are in family businesses or family offices, I want to point you to the example of Berta. Hubert Berta is one of the great men of the last 50 years. He recognized the opportunity in Eastern Europe. He recognized the opportunity in digital. He recognized the chance in Latin America. He's brought in partners such as Steffi and Paul, who are running the business in the way that it should be, which is for long-term capitalism and for the benefit of the employees and their communities, and not just for the shareholders. And so I guess family business has a special responsibility at this moment to try to make the case for what we do. And don't put your head down and don't hide. We need public leadership, and we need leaders such as the Berta.
As you, Richard.
Thank you.
We need leaders as you, Richard. And thank you for this. Thank you so much. I have a question. Richard, how did you manage to raise such a smart daughter?
Well, we spent a lot of time together. So my favorite Margot story is, all little girls have Barbies, and unfortunately one of her Barbies, the heads fell off. So I thought, well, how can I make this into something? So I told her the whole story of the French Revolution, and I made the Barbie into Marie Antoinette, and we showed the guillotine, and I explained. So anyway.
And I had a Ken doll that became Louis XVI as well. So
yes.
that also got the chop.
But anyway, it was always my dream that Margot would succeed me. So, you have to make sure that you spend time and that you show her the right way to behave, and also educate and play basketball with, and just laugh and like that.
Congratulations. And congratulations to this really insightful talk, to this passionate talk. I think everyone who watched this talk learned so much. I'm really, you activated me. I go back to my desk and energized and optimized. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steffi.
And Steffi, big hugs to
Big
you.
hugs.
Thank you.
Okay.
Family hug.
Okay, thank you, hug. Okay.
Ciao.
Ciao.